Okay, so this is the lecture about chapter 9 on photography. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you a quick whirlwind tour of the history of photography, which is a huge subject that I am very interested in. So it's kind of hard for me to pare it down to the essentials, but I successfully did that. So okay, let me get my PowerPoint here. Okay. All right. So chapter 9 is about photography, another medium. So we've been talking about drawing, painting, and now we're talking about photography. There's a lot of other mediums that artists use that are discussed in your text, like sculpture, film, craft, uh, installation. There's a lot of media, okay, but we're just covering drawing, painting, and photography. But I urge you to sort of page through those chapters, and maybe you'll find something interesting that you might like to do a presentation about at the end of the course. Because in the last couple of weeks, we'll have some class time for people to do a presentation about a contemporary artist of your choosing, and that's for extra credit on your participation grade. So if you're worried about your participation grade, you can get up to 10 extra points on your participation grade by doing a PowerPoint presentation about a contemporary artist. And one way to find one would be to page through some of those chapters that we haven't covered and the ones that we have. Okay. All right. So um, film photography and digital photography are relatively new art mediums, you could say. Film photography, well, it wasn't even on film at first, but photography as we know it didn't really happen until the mid 19th century, when a way to fix the image was discovered by a guy named Herschel, but we'll get to that in a minute. But before photography, there was photography like on film or digital photography, there was something called the camera obscura. And it was known maybe in prehistoric times, but certainly by the Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci knew about the camera obscura. So, what is the camera obscura? Well, camera just means room, and obscura just means dark. So, the camera obscura is a dark room with a hole. And here's the hole. Okay, so whatever's outside the dark room is projected onto the back wall across from the hole of the dark room. And, it seems like a kind of magic. And for a long time, there was no lens involved, even. It was just, a hole in the wall, literally. Okay, so, and you could, if you fixed your dark camera obscura upright, you could get inside there, you could put a piece of paper on the wall and just trace the image of whatever was outside. And if it was on skids, well, you could move it around. And eventually somebody figured out, okay, well, why don't we just build a box with a lens on it and a mirror so that the image will be projected onto this mirror and then bounced up to a piece of glass, and we can just put a piece of paper on there and trace off of that. So that's really kind of the first camera with a lens. It's just that there was no light sensitive material to capture the image, which was a big drawback because you still had to draw, which takes some time. Okay, but people are still using and making camera obscuras. They seem kind of primitive, but they're fun. So this is a picture that a person who's a graduate student at Clemson University in South Carolina, she made a camera obscura out of her bedroom, basically. And across, and here she is standing inside her camera obscura, and the image outside of trees and clouds and a building is projected onto the back wall of her bedroom. She blacked out the windows except for a little hole that the light could come through, and it's a pretty sharp image. And then she took a picture of herself standing in this camera obscura. So theoretically, she could put a big piece of paper here and just trace the image, But I think she was more interested in kind of looking at the image. So I actually use a small camera obscura. I'm going to get it and show it to you. Okay, so this is my camera obscura, otherwise known as a pinhole camera. So it's just a box. The way you use it is you take this wooden back out, this thing, and then you put your film in this film holder, 4x5 film, and then you insert the film holder into the back of the camera, like so. And then in front, there's a hole. It's a very small hole because this is a relatively small box. It's basically what we call a pinhole. So the pinhole, I'll hold it up to the camera here. Hopefully you can see the pinhole, which is tiny. It's literally the size of a pin. So when I want to expose the film, I pull the slide out so that the film is now facing the pinhole. And I just open the shutter and expose the film for however many minutes I've determined or seconds is required. Then I close that and put the dark slide back in, and then I can take the dark slide out and process the film in the darkroom. So that's a kind of camera obscura, also known as pinhole camera. Okay, so eventually though, somebody figured out how to use light sensitive materials on a support, in this case a piece of silver and a sheet of silver or some kind of metal, and coat it with a light sensitive material, silver iodide, and then expose it to light, and then develop the image out, and then fix the image. Fixing it was critical because for a long time people knew there were light sensitive materials that would create an image when the material was exposed to light, but they couldn't figure out how to make that permanent, how to make the image permanent. But Daguerre, a Frenchman, was really the first person to figure this out, and his process was called the daguerreotype. So that's kind of a long word that's hard to spell, but it's right down here. And then he donated that process to the government of France and eventually to the world. So the daguerreotype was really the first practical way to make a photograph, but it was a one-off photograph. That is, you could only make one per exposure. In other words, there wasn't a negative that you could make many, many prints from. It was just, if you wanted two portraits of yourself, one for you and one for your mother or whatever, you had to have two pictures made. Okay, but the daguerreotype was so beautiful, and this is one of the earliest daguerreotypes, and it's famous because it's a street scene in Paris, but there's no people, it seems like, except this guy here who's having his shoes shined. And the reason is the exposures are so long that people walking by just don't register on the plate, basically. This might have been a 10 or 15 minute exposure, and because this guy stood still for that time, his image was burned onto the plate, so to speak, but the other passers-by were just like ghosts. They just disappeared. Okay, so I saw this daguerreotype. This one made a big impression on me when I saw it in the Museum of Fine Arts at Houston because it's one of the biggest daguerreotypes I've ever seen. So most daguerreotypes are small, about the size of a playing card. But this is a full plate because the plates were about this big, maybe the size of a sheet of paper. And most people got a quarter of that. They're, when they went to the daguerreotypist to have a portrait made, they would get one like wallet size, you could say. But this is a full plate daguerreotype of Sam Houston, who was the first governor of Texas. He was an important guy, so he got a full plate daguerreotype and it's just impressive. They're very sharp and very realistic, but they're on metal, so they're shiny, kind of like, and they're best viewed in dim light. So really, daguerreotypes and tintypes, the slightly cheaper version, were really the first portraits that the average Joe could get. I mean, a painted portrait made by an oil painter or something would be very expensive because it would take a long time for the painter to make it, and you'd have to sit for hours for your portrait, But a daguerreotype could be made in a few minutes, or tintype, and they were relatively cheap. So everybody went and had their portrait made at their local daguerreotypist shop. And I'm pretty sure there must have been one in Cookeville because there's a camera at the Cookeville History Museum that looks as if it was probably used for making daguerreotypes or tintypes. They're big cameras. We'll see a picture of them in a minute. But this process came along just in time for the American Civil War. And a lot of soldiers had their portraits made in uniform before leaving for, the Army of Tennessee or the Army of Northern Virginia or whatever army they were in. And some, as you can see, and so I looked up tintypes from the Upper Cumberland, and I found some really interesting ones online. They're anonymous. I don't know who this person is, but he was obviously a very young soldier, maybe less than 18 years old, who's leaving to join, probably the Army of Tennessee with his cup and his canteen. You can see that the buttons have been hand painted, and a lot of these tintypes and daguerreotypes were hand painted like that. So it was a monochrome process. That is, it wasn't in color, but the photographer could touch it up with paint. And when you got you'd go in, you'd sit for your portrait, and then some days later you would come back and get it in a case. So they came in a book-like case that opened up like this, and you looked at them in dim light. They're not the kind of thing that you hang on the wall or you put on a table with your family portraits or something like that. They're much more personal than that. In fact, in bright light, you can't see them very well. You can see them better indoors, in sort of dim light, which makes them a very intimate form of photography, really. Okay, so here's an older soldier who looks like he's ready to kill Yankees. He's got his knife and his sword and his pistol stuck in his belt, and he looks really determined, I feel like. Maybe he'd already seen some action when he had this portrait made of himself. So again, if you're this guy and your mother sends you to the daguerreotypist to get a portrait made of yourself before you go off to war, but your girlfriend wants one too, you have to sit for 2 different exposures, and the exposures were kind of long. They weren't just like that. It would be more like maybe 10 or 15 seconds. So the most photographed person of the American of the 19th century was Frederick Douglass. Every time he got a chance, he would have himself photographed, which is interesting for the history of photography because you can see him photographed in different photographic processes. As new processes were invented, he had himself photographed again. So, but this is one of the earliest photographs of Frederick Douglass, the great orator and abolitionist, um, when he was a fairly young man, and this is a daguerreotype. And you can already see in his face uh, the kind of determination and courage that it took to be an abolitionist in this era. He was supposedly one of the greatest speakers that ever lived. Okay, so these daguerreotypists and tintypists, sometimes they were mobile. That is, they went from town to town. They'd go to a small town that didn't have a photographer and set up for a few days, make everybody's picture, and then go on to the next town. Which sounds kind of like a cool way to make a living, really. The cameras were very big and bulky, and heavy, and they had to be on a tripod. That is, they're not handheld cameras like modern cameras are. There's still people like myself who use um, these large tripod mounted, what are called view cameras. And so I'm going to show you my view camera now. Ta-da! Oops, it's kind of too dark. Pull it out a little bit. Okay, so this is my view camera. It's not as big as the ones in this picture. It's a 4x5 camera. That is, it uses 4x5 film. Here's the lens. Oops, it's too dark. Sorry. Should have pulled it out in the light a little more before I showed it to you. Anyway, the point is that contemporary photographers use these big cameras. And there are even contemporary photographers who use the daguerreotype process and the tintype process. So if we had time, I would show you some of those, but like I said, this is a huge topic, and so I've had to kind of pick and choose. Anyway, look into that, though, if you're interested. Okay, but after a while, a new process was discovered or invented called the wet collodion process, and it had some advantages over the daguerreotype. And the advantage of the wet collodion process is that you could make more than one print from your original exposure. So this is sort of the beginning of the idea of the negative. That is, you would make the exposure on a piece of glass that was coated with the wet collodion emulsion. And then once you developed and fixed that image on the glass, then you could make as many prints as you wanted. The wet collodion, the drawback to it, though, was that the wet collodion only stayed light sensitive while it was wet, so for about 10 minutes. So you had to coat it perfectly, make the exposure, develop the exposure, and dry, and then let it set to dry, all within 10 minutes, which is pretty demanding. And also it was a slow process. The emulsion itself was what photographers call a slow emulsion. That is, you couldn't make an exposure that fast. It would have to be a long exposure. So the lens would have to be open for, depending on the light, sort of a long time. So again, during the Civil War, the wet collodion process was used, but you couldn't photograph horses galloping by or people shooting at each other, whatever, because you just wouldn't see anything. It would just be a blur. So what Timothy O'Sullivan, who was a photographer during the Civil War, he could only photograph the aftermath of a battle. And in a way, this was kind of more effective. It was a little bit, well, it was more realistic than the usual heroic images of war that people saw in engravings and illustrations and things like that. This was sort of a message to Americans that, the Civil War involved, well, Americans knew this, but that the carnage was intense. The number of people that died as a percentage of the total population in the Civil War was mind-boggling, and everybody was affected by it, really. Um, but this sort of grotesque image of dead bodies on a field after a battle, I think, was still shocking to people, even though they knew that you know that the casualty rate was really high. This was, it says 1863. It was actually uh, right after the Battle of Gettysburg, which happened on July 3rd. The next day, or a few days after, O'Sullivan came and photographed the Union dead at the at Gettysburg. So you can see that it's summertime. The bodies have started to bloat. Rigor mortis is sort of pushing them up out in a weird way. It's a pretty disturbing image, I think, even from a distance of 160 years. I mean, I sort of find it hard to look at. um, but that's war. That's real. Okay, so after the war, O'Sullivan joined an expedition of scientists, geologists, and surveyors who went out to the American West to map the expanses of the American West that hadn't really been explored very much by European Americans anyway. Obviously, Native Americans had been there for thousands of years. And in fact, one of the things that O'Sullivan photographed were Native American cliff dwellings at Canyon de Chelly. So Canyon de Chelly is an amazing place in the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and one other state I can't remember. But anyway, it's where the ancestors of the Hopi people had lived. There, by the time O'Sullivan got there in 1873, there were not native people living in these apartment dwellings. So what we see here is a cliff and a multi-story uh, building here that, like 3 or 4 stories. It's big. It's hard to tell because it's hard to see the scale here, but these are huge apartment dwellings that the Anasazi people built at Canyon de Chelly and Chaco Canyon and other places. So these were multi-family dwellings made out of stone. And this particular one is sheltered under this beautiful cliff with these wonderful striations in the rock. But Canyon de Chelly was abandoned by the Anasazi probably in the 1300s. Like Chaco Canyon, it was also abandoned around that time, and people don't really know why, but possibly there was a catastrophic drought in North America at that time that caused those cities basically to be abandoned and the descendants to move elsewhere and become the Hopi Indians. Anyway, so this is one of the things that O'Sullivan photographed as part of this expedition to the American West. He had, as I was explaining to you before, he was still using the wet collodion process, which meant that he had to have a portable darkroom where he could coat the plates, expose them, and then go back to the portable darkroom and develop the plate before fixing it and drying it for the trip home. And the way he did that was he had a Civil War ambulance, a mule-drawn ambulance that he had repurposed as a darkroom. So this is what I would call hashtag extreme photography, because you can imagine that in the desert like this, it was also really hard to keep the plates moist enough. I mean, the air would be so dry that they would dry even quicker, I would think. And plus, keeping sand from sticking to the plate and all of that must have been really challenging, not to mention the challenge of getting these huge glass sheets, which they're pretty big, um, 11 by 14 anyway, 8 by 10, 11 by 14, getting those back home safely to the East Coast. And in fact, he did lose a lot of them. Some of them broke on the way home, but this one made it. He got it back to the East Coast and he was able to print it. It was a contact printing process, not an enlargement. Okay, so what kind of paper were wet collodion negatives printed on? So, not only did photographers in the mid-19th century have to coat their own um, glass to make a negative, they had to coat their own paper with a light-sensitive material. And that paper made what we call an albumen print here. So while the Civil War was raging in America, Julia Margaret Cameron was an aristocratic lady in England who didn't have to worry about hiding her silver from the Yankees or anything. She had a very leisurely life, and she devoted it to learning to this demanding craft, really, of being a large format photographer. And she mainly made portraits of children and her friends. She knew a lot of the eminent Victorians of the time. So in order to really to make this work, she had to have chickens because the albumen print is made out of egg white. That's what the albumen comes from, the egg white. So she had to carefully separate the eggs from the white and then mix the egg white with silver nitrate, I think, or silver chloride, some sort of light sensitive silver molecule, and then coat it with a brush or a glass rod in the darkroom, allow the paper to dry in the dark, and then meanwhile coat her glass with wet collodion, make the exposure, and then once the glass negative was dry, she could make a contact print by placing the glass negative on the light sensitive paper. And remember, there was no electricity, so she either just carried it outside in a printing frame and exposed it to sunlight for a while, or some photographers had like a little hatch they could open in their darkroom. They just opened that little roof hatch and let the light come in and expose the print, the paper. And then once she estimated that the exposure was done, you close the hatch and then, put the print in the developer and in the fix, sop and in the fix, and then wash the print. So it's a very demanding process. I've never done that whole process. The closest I've come to it is making some cyanotypes, but I've never made my own negatives. I have made the cyanotype printing process. Paper, which is like a blueprint. But I think it's simpler than the albumen process, probably. Okay, so once the wet collodion process came along, Frederick Douglass went again and had another portrait made of himself. And you can see he's aged somewhat. His hair is a little grayer, but he's still the fierce orator that he always was. Okay, so we've seen that photography was used to make portraits. It was also used to document, travel, like to the American West. And, people took it to the Middle East. They took pictures of the pyramids. I mean, photography was used for just about everything you could think of in the 19th century after its birth in the mid-19th century. But by the early 20th century, Stieglitz was thinking, well, why can't this be art? Like it could be something other than just making portraits and documenting landscapes or wars or things like that. Maybe photography could be like other forms of printmaking. It could just be purely for aesthetic delight, for visual delight, as your book would put it in the second chapter, I think, about the purposes and functions of art. And Stieglitz was really the first person to promote photography as a fine art form rather than as kind of a documentary form. And you can see that these photographs by Stieglitz, they look like sort of charcoal drawings or maybe lithography prints. They're soft. They're they're not about a fact, about documenting the presence of a person in front of the lens so much as they are about creating a mood or a feeling or just being nice to look at. And this style of photography was called pictorialism, and it prevailed for maybe, I don't know, 20 years or so in the early 20th century. So Stieglitz kind of moved on from there, you could say. Um, he he thought of himself as a modernist in the visual arts, and I think that the sort of romantic fuzziness of pictorialism was a little too not modernist enough for him. So he began photographing in a kind of more a sharper, you could say, way that wasn't as fuzzy and but still very concerned with fine art concerns like formalism, composition, design. It seems like a photograph is sort of like a matter of luck, especially a photograph like this that involves a cast of not thousands, but you know, somewhere between 20 and 50 people. You can't direct this really. He couldn't. He was on a transatlantic boat traveling to Europe as a passenger with a cabin, but there were also a lot of passengers that didn't have a cabin that were traveling sort of as immigrants back to Europe. And those were the people in the steerage. So that's the lower floor of the transatlantic ship that was going there. So these were people who didn't have their own room. They were just sort of sleeping and living in the bottom of the ship, you could say. So Stieglitz went out with his large format camera, about the size of mine probably, and saw all these people and suddenly perceived this kind of lucky composition where everything sort of came together. So I have a quote from Stieglitz here, if I can find it. In the meantime, what you can notice about this is, okay, here's the quote. There were men and women and children on the lower deck of the steerage, that is down here. There was a narrow stairway leading to the upper deck of the steerage, that's here. A small deck right on the bow of the steamer. To the left was an inclining funnel. And from the upper steerage deck, there was fastened a gangway bridge that was glistening in its freshly painted state. This is it. It was rather long, white, and during the trip remained untouched by anyone. On the upper deck, looking over the railing, there was a young man with a straw hat. Okay, here's that guy. The shape of the hat was round. He was watching the men and women and children on the lower steerage deck. A round straw hat, the funnel leaning left, the stairway leaning right, the white drawbridge with its railing made of circular chains, white suspenders crossing on the back of a man in the steerage below, round shapes of iron machinery, a mast cutting into the sky right here, making a triangular shape. I saw shapes related to each other. I saw a picture of shapes, and underlying that, the feeling I had about life. So basically he's talking about composition and design and the repetition of certain shapes that he saw. He says, with the steerage, Stieglitz abandoned the idea that photographs should bear some likeness to paintings. So originally he thought, okay, if it's going to be fine art, it's got to look like a drawing or a painting or a print. But now he's suddenly thinking, well, hold on, photography can be a fine art on its own terms without looking like some other medium. Because photography can still contain all those elements of art that we talked about in chapter 3 lecture. Line, shape, color, and also the principles of design from chapter 4, like repetition, etc. Okay, so that's important. That's sort of the beginning of really modern contemporary photography, I think. Okay, so up to this point, photographers had been using kind of big, bulky cameras that were hard. I mean, Stieglitz had a handheld camera, but it was still pretty big. But up to that point, most photographers had been using a camera on a tripod like the one I showed you in my room there. But in the mid 30s, smaller, lighter handheld cameras were invented, basically the 35 millimeter camera that we know and love, or knew and loved in the 1960s. But even, dedicated digital cameras, not the one in your phone, but like if you buy a Canon or a Nikon SLR, it's the size of a 35 millimeter camera. So once those small handheld cameras were invented and roll film was developed, that is, instead of sheet film, where you could load the camera with 35 exposures, unlike when I'm using my view camera or my pinhole camera, I carry, each one of these has 2 sheets of film in it, one on each side. So if I carry 3 of these with me on my walk, that means I have 6 exposures. That's the limit to how many pictures I can take that day. But with the 35 millimeter handheld camera, you could take 35 and you could carry another roll of film in your pocket and reload later on. So that increased the number of pictures you could take every day. Now this is the Leica that Cartier-Bresson had. The film is a lot smaller. It's the negative is tiny, and so a contact print is not going to work, but that's okay because now we have enlargers that can enlarge a tiny negative, size of this, to a large print. Okay, so let's go back to this photograph. So Cartier-Bresson was really one of the first people to make street photography into kind of a fine art form. So, and he had a lot of theories about the handheld camera and about photography. Most famously, the idea of the decisive moment. That is, that the trick in photography is taking the photograph at exactly the right moment, the decisive moment that reveals some truth. Okay, so what does this photograph reveal? Well, maybe I should get a larger version of this for the slideshow because it's kind of too small. Let me see if I can enlarge it a little bit so you can see it a little better. Okay. All right, maybe that's a little better. Okay, I'm going to minimize this. All right, so Cartier-Bresson is in Paris. He's wandering around Paris with his handheld camera. He sees a kind of flooded parking area or street, and he sees a man jumping from a ladder that's sort of in this flooded area. And the man is kind of in midair. His heel is about to touch the water, but he's really in flight, kind of, you could say. Like he hasn't landed yet. And so the reflection in the water of the man is still separate from the man himself. There's like a little space because he hasn't yet landed. And that in itself is pretty amazing, that he could take a picture at that exact moment. But there's other amazing things about this photograph. If you look at it carefully, you'll see that, like with Stieglitz's photograph, The Steerage, there's a repetition of shapes. So there's this sort of arc of the man's body, right? And it just so happens that in the background there's a circus poster plastered to this building with an acrobat's body in that exact pose. Well, I mean, her back is a little more flexible and bent, but she's also leaping away from one place to another in the opposite direction. So she's going this way, he's going this way. And then there's the rhyming shapes because of the reflection. Well, there's a reflection of the poster in the water as well. So you have this figure, and this figure all in a sort of curvilinear shape. And then this triangle shape of his leg is echoed here as well, and then in the roofs up here. So you have these triangles that repeat, you have these arcs that repeat, and not only in the bodies, but whatever this is, a piece of pipe, who knows? It's just lying there. But it also repeats this kind of arc shape. I mean, we could talk about this photograph for an hour, analyzing all the ways that shapes recur and the sort of brilliant composition here. Apparently, Cartier-Bresson almost never cropped his photographs, so this is how it was taken, you could say. Like he just had this instinctive ability to frame a photograph in a millisecond and make it at exactly the right time, which is a skill we should all kind of aim for, maybe. Okay. I mean, I try to do that a little bit. All right, so here's the Leica 35 millimeter camera that revolutionized photography. And this is Cartier-Bresson's Leica. I'm going to show you my Leica. Okay. Mine's a good bit beaten up, but it's basically from the same era, the mid-30s. It has a screw mount lens. How did I come about this? How did I get this? I bet you're wondering. Well, it's kind of a weird story. It came from Morganton, North Carolina. My grandfather lived there, and Mr. Kistler, who was the richest man in Morganton, died suddenly and left this camera to my grandfather. And he carried it for a long time. The back of it is in terrible shape. The stuff is coming off the back. But it's almost 100 years old and it still works. And I can pretty much guarantee you that no digital camera that you are using today will be able to work in 100 years. But this camera, I can still load film into it and I can still shoot with it. I would say the lens is probably not as sharp as it was because it wasn't stored perfectly, let's say. But it's pretty awesome, and I like it a lot. This is my Leica. Okay. It's actually kind of hard to load because you have to load it from the bottom. You can't take the back off completely. Well, maybe I'll talk about it some more later if we have time. Okay, again, this is the size negative that you put in the little rangefinder camera. We're going to skip that now. All right, so as usual, I have way more to talk about than I can cover. Okay, so photography, because of its truth claims, you could say, its claim that whatever is in the picture was actually in front of the lens at one time, was a powerful force for political reportage or political agitating, you could say. And in this case, let me just minimize this. Lewis Hine went around to various parts of North Carolina, maybe even including Morganton, and photographed young workers in these textile mills. So the South used to be full of cotton mills where cotton was processed into yarn and then into fabric. And in the early part of the 20th century, children worked in these factories. And these factories were dangerous. you know, the machines were power looms and power spinning jennies that could, you know, tear your finger off or your hair off. People lost fingers and limbs in these mills, and the dust from the cotton was also dangerous. So there was a movement to in the early 20s, and children worked in mines, kids worked in all kinds of industries in the 19th and 20th century in Europe as well as in America. And so there was a movement by 1908 or so to get to make this illegal, to make hiring children in factories illegal. And this was really the beginning of compulsory schooling. Schooling was supposed to take the place of factory work so that kids would have a place to go during the day while their parents were in factories. So Heinz's documentary of these child workers had a huge effect on sort of galvanizing public opinion about the plight of child workers in textile mills. So, and I think part of the effectiveness of this photograph is just that the shallow depth of field means that these looms seem to go on forever into the distance. You know, they seem enormous. You don't know how deep this space is. You only see this child sort of gazing into the lens with a sort of deer caught in the headlights look on her face, but you get the sense that this factory she's working in might be huge and that these machines she's working with are gigantic. Okay, so around 30 years later, photography had clearly not solved all the problems of the world because Walker Evans, another great documentary photographer, made this photograph in Alabama. So he was hired, he and his friend John Agee, forgotten Agee's first name. Anyway, they went down to Alabama and lived with people who were sharecroppers. That is, people who were tenant farmers working on somebody else's farm in exchange for a share of the crop that they produced. And in the mid-1930s, in the depths of the Great Depression, a lot of these people were desperately poor, as you can tell from the photograph. And Evans lived with them for a long, a summer, I think, at least, several months, and photographed 3 or 4 families that lived in Hale County. This is Bud Fields' family. And you can see that Bud himself, although he's probably not that old, he looks exhausted. And he's living in this sort of barely habitable house with a dirt floor in places with his wife, and it looks like her mother, and this very sad looking little girl, a little boy, and a baby. So, when we do this class in person, we usually spend some time talking about this photograph and what you notice, what you as the viewer see when you first look at this photograph, and what you see after you've been looking at it for a while. So maybe in the discussion period on Friday, this would be a good photograph for you to write a question about so that we can discuss it more at length. And I'll just leave it up to you to find the things in the photograph that you think are important to talk about, because it's kind of different for everybody. But this photograph always is very interesting to people. For me, it's fascinating because my grandparents were in their mid-30s when this photograph was made. So that means they were kind of the contemporaries of this family. That is, they were raising small children themselves, but not nearly in such desperate circumstances. And my parents were kids in 1936. So this little girl here, who might be 8 years old, she would have been a contemporary of my dad's. They might have been born the same year. This kid here, maybe he's 5 or 6 years old, he would have been the age of my mother. And this is all happening not too far from here. I mean, Hale County, Alabama is probably a 4 or 5 hour drive south of where we live. So these are the ancestors of people, probably people and certainly that sharecropper system was around in the Upper Cumberland at that time. We didn't really have cotton here too much, but other crops like tobacco and so on. Okay, so this is one of the most famous American photographs ever. And it's from the same era, the period of the Great Depression. So, the previous one was a picture of cotton farmers in Alabama. This is a picture of a displaced family who had been living in Oklahoma until the Dust Bowl came to Oklahoma, which was an ecological disaster that drove thousands, maybe 100,000 people from their homes in Texas and Kansas and Oklahoma away, because there was a long drought followed by these dust storms, and dust literally covered their farms to a depth of 6 or 7 feet. And so people just abandoned those wheat farms and moved to California to try, in cars and wagons and on foot. However they could get to California, they went there to look for work as migrant workers. And so Dorothea Lange had been hired by the WPA, which hired photographers, artists, and writers to document the Great Depression and the mass migration that occurred in America as a result of the Depression. And so she was photographing in California when she came across this mother with her 3 daughters in a lean-to tent that she had built. And they had moved there to work as pea pickers on the pea harvest. But there had been a frost and the peas had gotten killed and there was no work for them there. And her husband had gone to town to get a part for their car or something. And she was kind of stranded in this sort of refugee camp with all these other Okies, as they call them, farmers from Oklahoma, with these little kids. And, she's extremely worried, as you can see. I mean, who wouldn't be, But anyway, this photograph had a huge effect. It was published in newspapers on the East Coast and so on. Years later, somebody recognized this person. It was Florence Owens Thompson, who had a pretty hard life, but ended up okay. And here she is in a picture from the 80s, I think, with the same 3 daughters that are in this photograph here. So she, as I said, she had a hard life. Several of her husbands died of TB and various other things, but she just worked at every job she could think of. And in the end, she ended up living in California, and her daughters were fine, and the whole thing turned out fine. In part because of the New Deal, the social safety net that FDR created in the wake of the Great Depression. Okay, so just a couple more slides and then the lecture will be over. All right, so in addition to documenting kind of social problems, photography also has been a really powerful tool for environmentalists. And probably the most famous photographer in that vein is Ansel Adams, who photographed the national parks of the West, particularly Yosemite, which was his great subject, where he returned to over and over. So Yosemite became a national park fairly early in the 20th century. I'm not sure of the exact year. And Ansel Adams' photographs of Yosemite were were made into calendars that the Sierra Club mailed out. They were some of the most widely circulated photographs in the history of America, I feel like. Like, for a while in the 70s, everybody had a Sierra Club calendar on their wall that had pictures of Yosemite, these black and white pictures that Ansel Adams made. Um, so it just kind of made people aware of the grandeur, you could say, of the American West in particular, and why these spaces should be preserved from development or mining and logging and all those kind of things. But probably the most influential photograph ever made in terms of the environmental movement is this photograph made by a guy who was not a professional photographer. He was a professional astronaut, William Anders. And when the first moonshot happened, Anders was ready. He had a Hasselblad, a camera attached to his spacesuit, and he had color film in it. He was thinking ahead. And he saw the Earth rise over the horizon of the moon. I mean, this is something that the novelty of it maybe has sort of worn off. But think about it. I mean, on the Earth we see the moon rise in the east, the full moon, and then we see the sun rise and set every day over the horizon. But nobody had ever seen the Earth rise over the horizon of the moon. And so Anders looked out the window of the space shuttle or whatever it was before it landed, and he was like, oh my God, that's the Earth rising. And it even has a shadow on it like the moon has when we see the moon from the Earth. It's the shadow of the moon. So he took this beautiful picture of the Earth floating in space, this bright blue ball floating in a black void. And it just made an incredible impression on people on Earth to see how fragile looking our planet is and how beautiful it is, and how there's really, you can't see any lines that designate the border between Canada and the United States or anything like that. You just see clouds, you see ocean, you see land masses. And this really launched the environmental movement in the United States. By 1970, we had the first Earth Day, and there were Earth flags with similar photographs of the Earth in space. So I think it really gave people for the first time a sense of the planet, the Earth as a whole, and where we live, and how small it is, and how beautiful it is, but also the atmosphere and the area where we live, the little thin membrane of atmosphere on the surface of the world, how fragile that is. So again, yes, these were hugely influential photographs, but this was possibly an even more influential photograph. So we don't really have any more time. I could go on and on, but I won't. So again, let's talk about some of these photographs some more on Friday, hopefully. And I'll see you then. Bye.